of Job, and I've been trying not to make it take forever, as we did maybe in the book of John. We took, I don't know how many, 2 years or something to get through the book of John. And so a few weeks ago, we covered, what was it, 24 chapters or something. And this morning, we're going to be covering, I think, 6 chapters, from 32 to 37. And so if you'd like to open your Bible to that section. Now, I just want to remember, obviously, we know that in chapters 1 and 2, we are given a backstory that Job and his friends are not given, and his wife is not given this information, that the reason that God is allowing Job to go through these trials and to suffer is because Satan essentially has challenged God. God said, "Have you considered my servant Job?" And Satan said, well, Job's just, honoring and fearing you and obeying you because you haven't allowed him to be tested. You've got this hedge about him. You're protecting him. And so God said, you think that's true? Basically Job was kind of like a wager, if you will. And God said, I'll allow you to touch him, just don't touch his body, but you can do anything you want in his life, and don't take, and then, Satan did bring 4 trials back to back, the last of which was the death of his children through what sounds like a tornado in chapter 1 there, and then, Satan came back and was, again, it says that there was this council. And God said to Satan, "Have you considered my servant Job, how even though you've tested him, he still fears me and he still is turning from evil. He wants to love me and serve me and obey me." And Satan said, well, that's because, you haven't allowed me to touch his body. What will a man go through? What will it take for them to, basically give up everything because of pain in their body? And so God allowed him to test Job in that way, and I don't think that we can quite fathom the pain that Job went through. He gave him these boils head to toe, and you'll remember the first chapter, it was 4 different, very significant, very life-altering trials, but in chapter 2, it was simply an illness. And of course, we all have illnesses. We all go through different things, pain and difficulty in our lives, but I don't think we can quite fathom what Job was going through. And it says that he, in order to find relief from the pain, and I can just imagine that those boils would be like itching. You know how if you skin something or burn something and it doesn't take very long and your body's trying to heal, and so you find that itch, and so he took broken pottery and scraped it. And if you just, it's kind of like fingernails on a chalkboard. You just can feel that, just intense pain of scraping. And yet, Job was scraping it in order to find some relief, and yet that introduced more pain. And so here Job is, and he has lost his family, and this was probably over some duration of time. And so then through the chapters 3 through up through 31, we have in Job's sufferings, his friends have come to him, and initially they spent 7 days sitting with him and in the ashes, just sitting with him, and he was obviously in misery, and it even says that they couldn't even speak to him because they saw how distraught he was. And I think that is what God wants us to do when we have loved ones, and I'll say, a lot of times we think of loved ones as family, but we are family. We are loved ones. And when we see one another going through that pain, we join in that grief. And they sat and joined in that grief with him for those 7 days. And I think that's what Paul meant when he told us to weep with those that weep. And after 7 days, Job opened his mouth and he talked. I'm not going to preach through the whole book of Job. I feel like every week I go through the same, introduction, but I just like us to really have a setting of where we are in the book, and I feel like it's necessary for us to kind of revisit things, but we have this basically back and forth. Job starts and he declares some things. He's like in this, it's almost suicidal. It's not suicidal, but he's basically cursing the day he was born in chapter 3. And then he goes on and we see chapters 4 through 27, we see his 3 friends decide it's time to speak now. We were quiet for 7 days. Job spoke, and he just declared this misery that he's in. And almost, almost hopelessness. He was right on the line of total hopelessness. And so, Elihu basically says, well, I've tried to be quiet, but I just can't hold back anymore. And so he's not Elihu, that was, I can't remember, help me, I can't remember the first fellow's name. Eludes me right now, I'm sorry, but at any rate, so we see his friends speak up one after another. And they speak, and then Job responds. And then they speak, and Job responds. And this goes back and forth, 2 cycles of each of the 3 of them speaking. And so it's quite a long section. But, ultimately what we see is they're trying to find wisdom. They're trying to understand what is going on. Why are you suffering? And if you were to sum up all of what the 3 friends were telling Job, it was, you are being punished for sin. That's what they believed. And of course, we know, because we can read chapters 1 and 2, that was not the case. Job was not being punished for sin. Job was being tested because he was faithful. And so Job, after responding to each of his friends in chapter 28, right, it's not exactly the center of the book, but it's really the crux of the book. It all points back to chapter 28, and he's talking about, searching for wisdom. He's saying, mankind can go find gold and silver, and we can mine, and we can do all these things. And I kind of summed that up as saying that God had given mankind dominion over creation. And we have searched out all sorts of things in creation. I don't think there's anything wrong with, building telescopes and looking out into the heavens. And even building rockets and going and, landing on the moon or exploring. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You could question priorities of where we spend our money, I suppose, but I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think God created a universe that he wants us to explore. He wants us to have dominion over. Genesis chapter 1 tells us that, to have dominion. And yet one thing that mankind couldn't find, Job concluded, was wisdom. And we concluded that the reason that we can't find wisdom is that wisdom is not within the creation. It's outside of the creation. Wisdom resides with God outside of creation. And ultimately, the answer that Job came down to, if you were to, and I don't want you to do that right now, but if you were to turn to chapter 28, verse 28, and that's easy to remember, Job 28:28, that wisdom is to fear God, to recognize his awesomeness, to recognize who he is. And yes, that word fear, we kind of get confused. It can involve this being afraid. There is an aspect of, if we as sinners approach God without an atonement, then we should be afraid. But that's not what the idea is when he says fear God. No, we're to recognize the awesomeness of God. And Isaiah, when he saw God in Isaiah chapter 6, he trembled. Daniel trembled. Moses at the burning bush trembled. He was confronted with God himself. John, in the book of Revelation, we read, he saw Jesus Christ. And though he had walked with Jesus, John's the one that said, that our hands have handled of the word of life. Literally, John, well, I just picture that as very literal. John was saying our hands have handled this one. And yet in Revelation we see, this terror. Because God truly is awesome. And we, the rightful response for us is to recognize our inadequacy, our sinfulness, even though we've been atoned for, that should make us value the atonement that we received so much more. And so Job says that is where we find wisdom. We find wisdom in recognizing the awesomeness of God and who he really is, and we turn from evil. And so, really you could have ended the book of Job there, but that isn't where the book of Job ends. Job had gone on in the next several chapters, and he had still, his conclusion was, you're telling me that I've sinned, but I know I haven't sinned. I mean, Job isn't saying I'm perfect, I've never sinned, but what he's saying is that these trials that I've received are not coming because of some sin that I've committed. I know that I've loved God and I fear him, and I've turned from evil, I've eschewed evil. And so there was this dilemma. Well, why is it that God's allowing me to go through these things? If you're telling me that God has this kind of justice, we can call it retributive justice. You get what you deserve. That's the kind of justice that we think of. And so if this was a problem of evil and of justice, then Job was confused about it. And he basically drew the conclusion that if that's the case, then God was being unjust because Job hadn't committed some sin. And so, he was right on the line. I don't know if you would say that Job sinned in that or didn't sin in that. I don't know, but he was certainly right on the line. He was questioning God. Don't think it's a very wise thing for us to do. That's where he was. But I do want to say one thing about that. Job was seeking God in that. Even though he didn't know the answers, he didn't turn and reject God. He was seeking God. He loves God. He fears God. He wants to understand. Now, as we said a few moments ago, though people can, given dominion over creation, we can understand a lot of things about creation, and we can still, do all of this like continual research. We can invent all sorts of things. One thing we cannot do is explain or understand God, because he can't be tested like you can test some scientific theory. God is outside of creation. It's going to become important a little bit later in the book. But this morning, we come to a section after responding to each of his friends and honed in on true wisdom and was seeking vindication from God. We saw last week, ultimately, he was kind of judging God, saying God was unjust. And yet, up to this point, Job and his friends have operated on this principle of retributive justice. You get what you deserve. However, beginning in chapter 32 comes this one Elihu, or Elihu, I don't know, I've heard it pronounced both ways. A young man, not an old man. He makes a point of talking about how these others that were trying to give Job advice, how they were old, they were aged. And I think that we generally, and I think that there's truth in this, it's not always true, but generally we see age as indicating that there's some kind of experience, some kind of, and I'll use the word a little bit loosely, wisdom of life that comes with that age, of that experience, that going through things. And none of us here this morning are spring chickens. I'd like to think that I'm a spring chicken, but then again, I don't want to go around squawking, do I? No, but we've experienced things. We've gone through things. And so when we're going through something, we can look back on our lives and we can see what God has done in the past, and I think there's great wisdom in that. But Elihu is a young man, and he is going to rightly recognize some of the flaws in their reasoning and flaws in their conclusions, and yet he's going to declare himself to be wise. And he's a young man. Now, I don't know about you, but most of the time when someone's young and they stand up and try to tell something that they know what they're talking about, it's going to take some persuading. I don't necessarily believe just because someone, stands up and is confident that they really know what they're talking about, they're going to have to persuade me. It's going to be an interesting thing and we're not going to read through these chapters entirely today. I'll probably read more than I should, but we're going to see that Elihu indeed says some things that are true. He says some things that are true. However, through these 4 speeches, he gives 4 speeches back to back, no interruptions. He draws another wrong conclusion. And if we could read these this morning, and if I did know Hebrew and you knew Hebrew and I could read it in Hebrew, there's something interesting that we would see here. It would be helpful if we could, but we can't do that for many reasons. Obviously, none of us know Hebrew. But what we would find is that his speeches contain contradictions and inconsistencies and in fact, some silliness. In fact, it's my understanding that if you were to be reading through the Hebrew, that Elihu makes these arguments that appear almost gibberish. You say, why would God want those chapters, 6 chapters of gibberish from Elihu in the middle of Job, between when Job speaks and accuses God of being unjust and when God speaks out of the whirlwind? Why? That's an interesting question. I guess I can't really answer for God, but I can say this, it's you can even see it in English. Now, when it's translated into English, it kind of hides some of that gibberish, if you will. He uses idioms and things that in the Hebrew don't make any sense. I should have thought of a specific example of an idiom. You could think of idioms that we use. We sometimes use the word mixing metaphors. We use metaphors, raining cats and dogs. And you could maybe, and I don't have an example right now, but you could come up with examples of times when people say certain things and they're using one metaphor, but all of a sudden they switch to a different one. It's different, figure of speech, and it doesn't really make that much sense. And rather than understanding what the point is they're trying to make, you're sitting there thinking about, well, that didn't really make any sense. Now, I just want to give a little bit of an example of what I think of when I think of what Elihu is doing here. He's heard a lot of things from these, other people, these friends, and from Job, and he's obviously heard other things about God, and so he's kind of putting things together. It would be as if, when Dawn had her stroke, and I went down to Ohio State, and I was talking with the doctors. And I said, well, look, I saw this on Grey's Anatomy and, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not a doctor. I'm a computer programmer. But here I would be, talking to the doctor as if I know anything I'm talking about. And what am I basing it on? I'm not basing it on a medical study or anything like that, or even any serious, investigation. I'd be basing it on something I saw on TV, which is total fiction. And so Elihu here, he's one of these people. He's a know-nothing, know-it-all. I think that you'll see that as we read through a little bit of this. He fits the profile of this brash. He's intelligent, but he's a brash, intelligent young fool. So I'll cut to the chase, and then we'll come back here. But I just want to say that we, a lot of times, are intelligent young fools. We say things that we don't know what we're talking about. I mean, it's just a fact. We do this. We have confidence, and we hear something, and we echo it. And it's kind of like, a parrot. So I like to I like to listen to YouTube videos, forgive me. And the family of Ram burned with anger. He's coming and he's motivated out of anger. He burned with anger at Job because he justified himself rather than God, because Job was declaring his innocence. And he actually ended up, accusing God of being unjust. Job did. He burned with anger also at Job's 3 friends because they had found no answer, although they had declared Job to be in the wrong. Now Elihu had waited to speak to Job because they were older than he. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of these 3 men, he burned with anger. They should be able to give him an answer, shouldn't they? But his response was to be angry. It's so interesting. Here is Job going through this suffering, and Elihu is angry because Job was, self-righteous and was accusing God of not being just, and his 3 friends couldn't give a proper answer. Well, so what did Elihu say? Verse 6, I am young in years and you are aged. Now just think as we're going through here, what is he really saying? What is really being communicated? Okay, I am young and you are aged. Therefore, I was timid and afraid to declare my opinion to you. I said, let days speak, in other words, the older men, and many years teach wisdom. But it is the spirit in man, the breath of Almighty, that makes him understand. Okay, so there's a little nugget there. We get our wisdom, our knowledge, our intellect from the Almighty. That is true. It is not the old who are wise, nor the angel who understands what is right, the aged who understands what is right. Therefore I say, listen to me. Let me also declare my opinion. Behold, I waited for your words. I listened for your wise sayings. While you searched out what to say, I gave you my attention. And behold, there was none among you who refuted Job or answered his words. Beware lest you say, we have found wisdom. God may vanquish him, not a man. He has not directed his words against me, and I will not answer him with your speeches. So far, he's just said, you didn't give an answer, now listen to me. That's basically what he's saying so far. They are dismayed, they answer no more. They have not a word to say. These 3 aged men, they don't have anything more to say. And shall I wait because they do not speak, because they stand there and answer no more? I will also answer with my share. I will also declare my opinion. He's just saying, I'm going to answer. That's all he's saying here. For I am full of words. We could say with 6 chapters, Elihu, you are definitely full of words. The spirit within me constrains me. I'm trying not to speak too much, but I'm overflowing. Behold, my belly is like wine that has no vent, like new wineskins ready to burst. I must speak. Well, speak already. Literally, you can just see the silliness that's coming out of his mouth. All he is saying for 2 chapters is that it's my turn to speak. I must speak that I may find relief. I must open my lips and answer. I will not show partiality to any man or use flattery toward any person, for I don't know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. Now that's chapter 32. Chapter 33, but now hear my speech, O Job, and listen to all my words. We've been listening. We're not hearing anything yet. He's literally a know-nothing know-it-all. Behold, I open my mouth. The tongue in my mouth speaks. My words declare the uprightness of my heart. Now we're getting somewhere. Now we see some self-righteousness coming out of Elihu. And what my lips know, they speak sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Answer me if you can. Set your words in order before me. Take your stand. Behold, I am toward God as you are. I was pinched off from a piece of clay. I was made from the dust of the ground just like you were. Okay, there's a nugget of truth, yes. Behold, no fear of me need terrify you. My presence will not be heavy upon you. Surely you have spoken in my ears, and I have heard the sound of your words. Okay, now we finally get to what Job, he's saying, not Job, Elihu heard Job say. He says, you say, I am pure without transgressions. I am clean, and there is no iniquity in me. Behold, he finds occasions against me. God finds occasions against Job. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks and watches all my paths. So Elihu says, behold, in this you are not right. You're wrong, Job. I will answer you, for God is greater than man. Why do you contend against him? And, he will answer none of man's words. For God speaks in one way and in two, though man does not perceive it. In a dream, in a vision of the night, when deep sleep falls on men while they slumber on their beds, then he opens the ears of men and terrifies them with warnings, that he may turn man aside from his dead and conceal pride from a man. So, maybe, Job, you did hear from God, but maybe it was a dream. Because remember, all this time, God has been silent. And God is still being silent. But he's, basically he's saying, God, listen to me and I'll teach you wisdom. And he begins here to get into some of the, God is just. And he goes on down, and if we see I'm in the wrong chapter now. Let me go on down to chapter 34. I'm not going to try to read the whole thing. You don't really want me to. Let's go down to 34. Let's read verses 1 to 10. He says, Then Elihu answered and said, Hear my words, you wise men. Again, he's still just, listen to me, hear me, give ear to me, you who know, for the ear tests words as the palate tastes food. Let us choose what is right. Let us know among ourselves what is good. For Job has said, I am in the right, and God has taken away my right. In spite of my right, I am counted a liar. My wound is incurable, though I am without transgression. What man is like Job, he says, who drinks up scoffing like water, who travels in company with evildoers, and walks with wicked men? Now, who's Elihu talking about? And frankly, I have to tell you, I don't really know. It's not making a lot of sense. He might be talking about the three guys that just spent, the last several, 24 chapters going back and forth with Job. He might be calling them evil. But at any rate, he's like, Job goes around with these evildoers. It's kind of an accusation against Job. Verse 9, for he said, it profits a man nothing that he should take delight in God. And Job did conclude, I fear God and obey God, and yet I get these trials. What is the benefit of fearing him and obeying him? And I think that we can relate with that when we're going through a severe trial, when we have lost a loved one, or when we are on our deathbed, or whatever it might be, when we are just on our bed crying before God, as David described that he was. Sometimes we wonder, what is the value in obeying God if this is what we get? Well, verse 10, therefore hear me, you men of understanding. Far be it from God that he should do wickedness, and from the Almighty that he should do wrong. Now, he's saying something true. God is just. God's not going to do wickedness. That's true. And I'm not going to read the whole chapter, but if you go down there to verse 37, you see he's talking about Job. Verse 35, Job speaks without knowledge. His words are without insight. Would that Job were tried to the end, because he answers like wicked men. For he adds rebellion to his sin. He claps his hands among us and multiplies his words against God. And so actually, if you read that, he's not just saying that his sin is rebellion. He's saying he must have already sinned. So he's actually agreeing with the other three friends, but he's saying now, in addition to whatever sin, he's added rebellion to his sins. And so that's really the end of his second speech there. The third speech is about God transcending over morality. And we're just going to read chapter 35, verses 1 to 8. It says, and Elihu answered and said, I guess he answered himself, because no one else was speaking here. Do you think this to be just? Do you say it is my right before God that you ask, what advantage have I? How am I better off than if I had sinned? I will answer you, and your friends with you. Look at the heavens, and see, and behold the clouds which are higher than you. Oh, verse 8, okay. If you have sinned, what do you accomplish against him? And if your transgressions are multiplied, what do you do to him? In other words, you're not impacting God by sinning. Of course, we know that's really not true. You are impacting God. You're not changing him, but he takes offense to our sin. God takes righteous offense to our sin. Anyway, verse 7, if you are righteous, what do you give to him? What good is it for you to be righteous? Or what does he receive from your hand? Your wickedness concerns a man like yourself, and your righteousness a son of man. It doesn't really affect God, he's saying. Well, we know it affects God. Now, we're given the insight in chapters 1 and 2 that actually his fear of God and his walking with God was the whole reason that God gave him as an example to Satan. He was pleasing God by representing God's image, by being faithful. But Elihu, his words are foolishness. He's just saying here, God is far above creation. Sin and righteousness cannot affect him. He's so far removed from the creation, which it's a lie. It's not true. And then he goes on down and he's going to talk about God not answering Job's complaints. Why doesn't God answer Job's complaints? Pick it up in verse 13. Surely God does not hear an empty cry, nor does the Almighty regard it. How much less when you say that you do not see him, that the case is before him, and you are waiting for him. And now, because his anger does not punish, and he does not take much note of transgression, he does not take much note of sin. Job opens his mouth in empty talk. He multiplies words without knowledge. Basically saying, God's not answering you, Job, because your complaints are empty, because he's not listening to you, because you're not saying anything worth listening to. That's what Elihu is saying. Elihu is foolish. He's the one. And actually, if you look at it, in chapter 38, God will respond, but who does he respond to? He doesn't respond to Elihu. It's like Elihu was just a noise. And God, out of the whirlwind, responds to Job. And then he does refer back to the three friends, but he responds to Job when he responds. He doesn't respond to Elihu. So Elihu's just completely wrong. And then he comes in the fourth speech here in chapters 36 and 37. And he basically says here, we'll read verses 1 to 12. And Elihu continued and said, bear with me a little. We've been bearing with you, Elihu. And I will show you, for I have yet something to say on God's behalf. Now Elihu is going to answer for God. I will get my knowledge from afar and ascribe righteousness to my Maker, for truly my words are not false. One who is perfect in knowledge is with you. I don't think he's talking about himself there. I think he's talking about God, because now in verse 5 he's going to say, behold, God is mighty and does not despise any. He is mighty in strength of understanding. He does not keep the wicked alive, but gives the afflicted their right. He does not withdraw his eyes from the righteous, but with kings on the throne he sets them forever, and they are exalted. And if they are bound in chains and caught in the cords of affliction, then he declares to them their work and their transgressions, that they are behaving arrogantly. He opens their ears to instruction and commands that they return from iniquity. If they listen and serve him, they complete their days in prosperity and their years in pleasantness. But if they do not listen, they perish by the sword and die without knowledge. Now, again, those two verses there, what's that saying? That's saying that retributive theology is correct, that you get what you deserve in this life. And while there's a general truth in that, it's not true across the board. We know this. That's the whole point of the book of Job. He's not getting what he deserves. It's not about that he's been evil and he's being judged. That's not, the answer. If we believe in retributive justice, that God is that every trial comes because of sin, then we're going to be an unhappy Christian. We're probably eventually going to reject him because we're going to encounter trials that we don't understand. And so we can't fall into that trap. But Elihu, even though he had said that these other friends were wrong, he falls into the same trap. The godless in heart cherish anger, for they do not cry for help when he bids them. We'll just stop there. You can see he's kind of incoherent. He's saying some things that are true, but they're just as an argument as a whole, he's just incoherent. But he's saying that suffering. Let's go back to verse. Basically, that God is using suffering to teach. Suffering is God's divine instruction, and it's ultimately going to lead to restoration. But if we go on down, the speech concludes in chapter 37 with and again, this is something that is true. The majesty of God. He's going to conclude with this, what we call a theophany, this description of God's power displayed through thunder and storm. And there's truth in that. That is true. But he says, "Hear this, O Job, stop and consider the wondrous works of God. Do you know how God lays his command upon them and causes the lightning of his cloud to shine? Do you know the balancings of the clouds, the wondrous works of him who is perfect in knowledge? You whose garments are hot when the earth is still because of the south wind, can you, like him, spread out the skies, hard as a cast metal mirror? Teach us what we shall say to him. We cannot draw up our case because of darkness. Shall it be told him that I would speak? Did a man ever wish that he would be swallowed up? And now no one looks on the light when it is bright in the skies, when the wind has passed and cleared them. Out of the north comes the golden splendor. God is clothed with awesome majesty. The Almighty, we cannot find him. He is great in power. Justice and abundant righteousness he will not violate. Therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit." And after speaking of God's majesty, chapter 38 begins, and we're not going to continue here, but then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind. And we see this, God doesn't just answer Job, he answers Job out of the whirlwind, out of the tornado, out of the storm. And so in a sense, God proves Elihu's point, but it's almost like Elihu was cut off in the middle of what he was trying to say. And I find it rather ironic, if you read through this whole section, Elihu's saying, I have something important to say, you need to listen to me, blah, blah, blah. And he gets down to the end and says, therefore men fear him. He does not regard any who are wise in their own conceit. But Elihu is wise in his own conceit. Well, it is it's a little bit difficult to really look at this section and say, why do we have this? But I really think that what we are to learn is that, when we just start speaking about things we don't know about, this is what we sound like. It's almost like Elihu is proving that God cannot be explained. Though Elihu tries to explain God, and he tries to defend God, God doesn't need Elihu to defend him. God is going to defend himself. I just want to close with a couple of points for us to hopefully take home. It's a little bit hard, you can see, to take a message like this and to translate that into application. But I'm going to do the best I can here. And then I'm going to read several verses that I think are related or that represent the things that we're learning from Elihu. First, while there is clearly a role for logic and intellect, intelligence, those things can never prove or explain God who created these things. 1 Corinthians 13 comes to mind. If I speak in the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, I am a noisy gong or a clanging cymbal. And that's what I hear when I read Elihu. It's almost painful to read it. And I probably read more than I should have, but I wanted you to kind of experience some of that with me, because Elihu doesn't make much sense. And I think, while this isn't about love in particular, it is about love of God. When we fear God and keep his commandments, why? Why are we doing that? Why are we keeping his commandments? Jesus said, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. And so Paul says, if I speak, no matter what I do, if I speak of the tongues of men and of angels but have not love, then it makes me sound like this, hollow, empty, a clanging cymbal. Secondly, our intellectual reasoning can actually become a barrier of arrogance. And that arrogance actually becomes a blinder to us. We fail to see the truth when we just think we're right. Elihu was blinding himself with all his flowery language. And what is it blinding us to? It's blinding us to our Creator, the author of the reasoning ability that we have, who gave us the ability to think, to have an intellect, to reason. God gave us that. Rather than spending our time, dwelling on our own intellect, we should be worshiping him. Of course we should use our intellect. The book of Proverbs says, do you see a man who is wise in his own eyes? There is more hope for a fool than for him. A fool. At least a fool doesn't, can, but doesn't, he's not saying, I know everything. I mean, there are certainly fools like that, but it is the one who thinks he knows everything. He's wise in his own eyes. We don't want to allow our intellect, our ability to reason, our logic to become a barrier. We don't want to become arrogant that way. And third, I'm reminded when I think about Elihu and his just gibberish, reminded of Paul's warning against vain babblings. O Timothy, guard the deposit entrusted to you. Avoid the irreverent babble and contradictions of what is falsely called knowledge. There's actually several other places where Paul refers to vain babblings, empty words. He says in Titus 3:9, but avoid foolish controversies, genealogies, dissensions, and quarrels about the law, for they are unprofitable and worthless. And I just want to note that when he says genealogies, he's not talking about skip over, Luke chapter 1 or Matthew chapter 1, because there's genealogy there. That's not what he's saying. He's saying when he says genealogies there, it was very important to the Jews what their lineage was, what tribe were they a part of. So he doesn't want that to become part of their, something they spend their time debating. It's unprofitable and worthless. And that's what Elihu's words are. They're unprofitable and useless. And I only preach through these chapters because they're here. I don't preach through these chapters because Elihu has some wisdom. We've referred also to the book of Ecclesiastes, how that Solomon, in the end of Ecclesiastes, concludes that, let us hear the conclusion of the whole matter, that we should fear God and keep his commandments, which is pretty much the same thing as Job concluded, which is the same thing we see throughout the book of Proverbs. Fear God and keep his commandments. But in the beginning of Ecclesiastes, there's the storm, right? It's raining outside. Ecclesiastes 1:18, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. And how that he goes on and he talks about the vanity. Solomon was supposedly the wisest man in the world. He asked for wisdom and God gave him wisdom. And yet Solomon explored everything in life. He had riches and he explored all these different things. And that's what the book of Ecclesiastes is about. And that's why he comes down to the end and he says that the conclusion is our human wisdom is not wisdom at all. In fact, we know that the wisdom of man is foolishness with God. Of course, Job, in the 28th chapter, where shall wisdom be found and where is the place of understanding? He was searching for it, and then he came down to verse 28. I mentioned it earlier. Behold, the fear of the Lord, that is wisdom, and to turn away from evil is understanding. Jeremiah 9, thus says the Lord, let not the wise man boast in his wisdom. Let not the mighty man boast in his might. Let not the rich man boast in his riches. But let him who boasts boast in this, that he understands and knows me, that I am the Lord who practices steadfast love, justice, and righteousness in the earth. For in these things I will delight, declares the Lord. That is where our boasting should be. Again, outside of the creation, in the Creator. And Paul, I apologize for just going through these one after another, but in the name of time, I'm trying to get through. 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul says, for the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and the discernment of the discerning I will thwart. Where is the one who is wise? Where is the scribe? Where is the debater of this age? Has not God made foolish the wisdom of the world? For since in the wisdom of God the world did not know God through wisdom, it pleased God through the folly of what we preach to save those who believe. For Jews demand signs and Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and folly to Gentiles. But to those who are called, both Jews and Greeks, Christ, the power of God and the wisdom of God. For the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. Let's just close with my favorite chapter in the Bible. Does anybody know what that happens to be? I bet Dawn knows. She probably can't say it, but Romans chapter 8, and it begins in verse 18. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but verse 18, for I consider, Paul says, that the sufferings of this present time are not worth comparing with the glory that is to be revealed to us or in us. And I read this because we encounter suffering. And so when we study Job, what do we come away with? There isn't an answer to why suffering. There really isn't an answer to that. Paul says in Romans 8:26-39, likewise, the Spirit helps us in our weakness. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. For we do not know what to pray for as we ought, but the Spirit himself intercedes for us with groanings too deep for words, and he who searches hearts knows what is the mind of the Spirit, because the Spirit intercedes for the saints according to the will of God. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. And what is that purpose? For those whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. That is the purpose, to conform us to his image, in order that we might be the firstborn among many brothers, that there may be many who are made in his image, reformed in his image to represent him. And those whom he predestined, he also called, and those he called, he also justified, and those whom he justified, he also glorified. What shall we say then to these things? If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also with him graciously give us all things? Who shall bring any charge against God's elect? It is God who justifies. Who is to condemn? Christ Jesus is the one who died, more than that, who was raised, who is at the right hand of God, who is at the right hand of God, who indeed is interceding for us. Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation, or distress, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am sure that neither death nor life, nor angels nor rulers, nor things present nor things to come, nor powers, nor height, nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God in Christ Jesus our Lord. And so this is Paul's response to suffering. This is Paul's answer to why suffering. And really it's the same thing as Job's. Ultimately, we seek him. We find wisdom in him. We find relief in the fact that he loves us. It doesn't mean that everything is going to go our way in this life. We are going to suffer. He told us that. You know, if we seek wisdom, we can't find it. But the true wisdom is found in seeking God, fearing him, and becoming like him through obedience to him, reflecting his image perfectly. I'm reminded of that old story about the silversmith, and I don't have it written in front of me, so I'll probably get something wrong, but there's an apprentice that was working with this silversmith, and he said, was teaching him how to purify the silver. You know, you have to heat it over the fire just long enough, but not too long. And so the apprentice said, well, how do you know how long to heat it for? And he said, oh, well, that's easy. You just, I look over it, and when I see my image perfectly reflected, then I know that it's done and I can take it off, and it won't be ruined because it won't be burned up. And so God wants to see his image in us. I think that's probably the best analogy that I can think of for why suffering, because he wants us to be in his